This episode is called The Disappearing Girl. On a hot day in July of 2011, Dr. Barbara Elliott stood on a lakeside dock in Minnesota behind 3 of her 4 teenage daughters. The girls were all looking out over the water where their 4th sister, 13-year-old Emma, was learning how to water ski. Their father, William, was driving the motorboat, and behind it was Emma, getting pulled right along. At some point, Emma stood up on her skis, but only long enough to hit a big wave and go tumbling down beneath the surface again. But all the sisters cheered when their dad circled back around, and Emma motioned from the water that she wanted to try again. And this time, once the boat started going, Emma was able to stay upright a lot longer, and her older sisters went crazy, jumping and clapping as Emma sailed across the water. Emma's mother, Barbara, beamed with pride, and not just because Emma had learned to water ski in just a single afternoon, but because she was just very proud of Emma's determination. Emma had Down syndrome, which meant that she was born with an extra copy of chromosome 21. The extra chromosome affected the way her brain developed, so she was growing up with some mental and physical challenges. And so Barbara, who was a developmental pediatrician, knew full well how much harder learning how to water ski would be for Emma than it would be for her sisters. But Barbara realized very early on that she should never doubt Emma. Emma had always been outgoing and athletic. She loved soccer and swim practice. She took ice skating lessons and karate classes. She was also a social butterfly and was looking forward to starting middle school in the fall. Basically, whenever Emma set her mind to something, she always thrived. Emma skied for a few more seconds before losing her grip on the tow rope and splashing back into the water. But a second later, Emma came back up for air and gave her family a big thumbs up. Barbara could see Emma's big smile all the way from the dock. 5 months later, in December, Barbara meandered her way through a Christmas tree farm, enjoying the smell of freshly cut pine trees. Her daughters were up ahead, choosing which Christmas tree they should strap to the roof of the car and bring home. William was next to them, setting up his camera on a tripod. This had become a sort of annual tradition in their family. They would come to this farm to pick out their tree and take a family Christmas photo. In the past, the way this typically went is Emma would run all around the farm until she found the perfect tree, at which point she would loudly announce it to the rest of her family, and then that would be the tree they would choose. But this year, Emma seemed checked out from the whole process. She kept staring off into space while her sisters tried to get her attention. Her oldest sister, Mallory, kept asking her questions, but Emma just ignored her. And then when she finally answered, her words were slow and labored, like she was talking with peanut butter in her mouth. Barbara wondered if this was just typical teenager stuff. Emma was 13 after all. Her personality was bound to change a little bit. But Barbara still couldn't help but feel worried about her youngest daughter. She wondered if maybe something was going on at school that had her mind occupied. William finally got the camera all set up and then told the girls to smile for a photo. But Emma just stared at the ground. Barbara called Emma and told her to look up, and she did, but by the time the camera flashed, Emma was staring back at the ground again, lost in her own world. William had to take the picture 3 more times just to get a shot with Emma looking at the camera. And even then, she wasn't smiling. One morning, a few weeks later, Barbara was in the kitchen pouring herself a bowl of cereal. The rest of her family was already eating around the table. Well, all of them were eating except for Emma, who was just slumped over in her chair, picking at her food and staring at the half-melted Christmas candles in the center of the table. She'd been quiet all morning, even though Mallory had been asking her questions, like whether she was excited to return to school and see her friends again. And so eventually, Mallory just began asking Emma really basic questions that, frankly, she didn't care about the answers at all, like what day of the week is it and what time is it? But Emma didn't even look up. At this point, Barbara exchanged a worried glance with her husband William and also her other daughters. Emma had been withdrawn like this for all of winter break. She avoided eye contact and barely spoke to any of them. She hadn't helped them decorate the Christmas tree, and she got moody whenever anybody asked her questions. And even stranger, Emma hadn't wanted to see any of her friends over break. But as Barbara thought back even farther, like over the whole last few months, she realized Emma had been through a very difficult time. Emma had just started middle school, and she was immediately taken out of general education and put in special education classes for the first time in her life, which could have felt like a demoralizing setback. Maybe she was so upset about what was going on at school that was having a profound impact on her life. She wasn't sleeping very well, perhaps because she was thinking about this stuff, and perhaps the lack of sleep was making her irritable and not really interested in talking to anyone. But trouble at school didn't really explain why Emma now was just completely ignoring her sister. Barbara knew Emma would never give Mallory the cold shoulder for no reason. This behavior was radically out of character. Emma adored her big sister. Barbara had worked in pediatric medicine long enough to know that whatever was going on with Emma was not normal, and so she would have to see her doctor. When Barbara and Emma went in to see her pediatrician, he immediately ordered a full medical workup for Emma. He ran all sorts of tests, like an EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain, also a sleep study, a vision and hearing screen, and full blood work. But none of these tests showed anything wrong with Emma. But just to make sure they covered all their bases, the pediatrician also ordered an MRI of Emma's brain, which creates a detailed scan of the body using magnetic waves. And the MRI did show a few small abnormalities in her brain, but nothing that would explain the apathy, lack of focus, and intellectual decline Emma seemed to be experiencing. And so after that, the pediatrician said he had no further tests to recommend. Whatever was going on with Emma, it didn't seem like a problem he could fix. Several weeks later, after the winter break was over, Barbara was upstairs helping clean Emma's room. Emma used to clean it herself, but she wasn't doing her chores anymore. On top of Emma's increasing social isolation, she'd also begun having these frequent crying episodes. But just as the tears would dry up, she'd burst into fits of laughter. And also, Emma had become hypersensitive to noise and touch. She wouldn't even let her mom brush her hair. She barely slept at all, which Barbara knew was taking a further toll on her mood and energy levels. Her daughter seemed like a shell of her former self. It was emotionally very painful for Barbara to clean Emma's room these days, dusting the trophies and mementos that lined her shelves. They were all reminders of who Emma used to be, a girl who was thriving. Once Barbara was finished dusting, she picked up Emma's backpack, which was overturned on the floor. And as she lifted it up, a small bundle of papers fell out. She was about to set the papers on Emma's desk when she realized the papers were actually letters written by Emma to her favorite teachers. Now, Barbara would never invade her children's privacy if she could help it, but given everything going on with Emma, she gave herself permission to dive into these notes. They were all about Emma's struggles in school. Some of the students in her new special education classes were too aggressive, she wrote. They would throw fits and shout, and this really upset her. But the teachers yelled at her too, which upset her even more. She didn't like school anymore, and she just wanted to go back to 5th grade. Barbara noticed that all these letters were written back in September and October, about 6 months ago, right around the time that Emma first became lethargic and reclusive. Barbara realized that Emma had known all those months ago that something was wrong. She'd written these letters basically asking her teachers for help, but for whatever reason, it appeared like she was either too shy or too overwhelmed to actually deliver them. Reading her daughter's notes was heartbreaking for Barbara, but it was also fairly informative. She began to wonder if maybe she was wrong to think that her daughter's struggles were a medical issue. If Emma was having this much trouble adjusting to her new school, maybe her condition was actually psychological. Several months later, in the summer of 2012, Barbara sat at the dinner table watching Emma eat. Emma was bent over her plate, shoveling food into her mouth, and swallowing it so quickly she barely had time to chew. Emma had been an eating machine over the past few months, but tonight she was really gorging herself. Even though Barbara was a pediatrician herself, she could not explain why her daughter's behavior had changed this much. After Barbara had found Emma's letters, she and her husband had taken Emma to every therapist and psychiatrist they could find. And one psychiatrist, who specialized in children with disabilities, diagnosed Emma with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, due to the difficult transition from elementary school to middle school. She'd prescribed Emma antidepressants, and at first they appeared to work. But then she complained that the medication made her feel dizzy, and so they stopped it. And unfortunately, the next medication they tried made her insomnia worse, and the next one after that gave her stomach pain. The only drug that Emma could tolerate was memantine, a medication used to treat memory loss in dementia patients. And in reality, it only helped a little bit. nothing was able to bring Emma back to her old self. Barbara was frustrated that after consulting with so many doctors and therapists, that no one could find a treatment that worked for Emma, or could even diagnose exactly what was wrong. She was beginning to realize that if she and her family were going to get Emma back, she was going to have to find answers herself. Almost a year later, in 2013, Barbara stood in front of a big lecture hall, clicking through slides on a projector. She was a speaker at a conference of Down syndrome researchers, and she was presenting her daughter's case to the community. She fought to keep a neutral face when she played videos of her daughter water skiing and enjoying time with her friends and family, the way she'd been just a few years ago. But as painful as that was, Barbara pressed on, explaining all the details of Emma's startling regression. And as she presented her daughter's case, she couldn't help but notice a few audience members wiping tears from their eyes. A couple days later, Barbara received an email from a woman who had seen her presentation. The woman's name was Lucy Duncan, and like Barbara, Lucy was searching for answers. When Lucy's daughter Sierra was 20 years old, she went through a very similar regression to Emma. Lucy had tried many treatments for her daughter, but all of them were unsuccessful. Lucy had found a medical researcher who'd taken some interest in Sierra's case, but so far nothing had come from that either. Barbara thought Lucy sounded just like her. They were both mothers desperate to bring their daughters back. But also, as Barbara read this email, something else clicked. There were other people out there with Down syndrome who were also suffering from this mysterious, steady decline. And so Barbara wrote back to Lucy and promised they would stay in touch. They'd compare notes in the coming months and hopefully figure out what was causing their daughters to regress. Or, better yet, find a treatment plan that actually helped their kids. More than a year later, Barbara was sitting inside of a doctor's office, watching as a nurse used what looked like two robot arms to touch Emma's head. These arms were giant magnets that stimulate nerve cells in the brain to try to relieve symptoms of major depression. Recently, Barbara had taken Emma to a new psychiatrist who diagnosed her with catatonia, a disorder that interrupts normal brain function. People with catatonia struggle to communicate and lose their motor skills. This psychiatrist had recommended a 4-week course of this cranial nerve stimulation in hopes it would improve Emma's mood and help her engage with her friends and family again. Thankfully, this sort of bizarre treatment did not seem to bother Emma, who was now 16 years old. She was watching Taylor Swift videos on her phone, seemingly unaware that the nurse was pulling a strap across her head and getting ready to turn on these robot arms. The nurse flipped on the machine, and a metallic clicking sound filled the room. Barbara winced, but Emma seemed absolutely fine. So Barbara stopped worrying and leaned back in her chair. On the way home, Barbara didn't notice much of a change in Emma. But one night, after a few weeks of treatment, Barbara went upstairs to get ready for bed. She passed Emma's room, expecting to see the desk lamp on and Emma sitting at her desk watching YouTube. But instead, the room was dark. Curious, Barbara poked her head in, and to her shock, Emma was in bed, sound asleep, not staring at the ceiling, racked with insomnia, not pacing or zoning out or acting moody, just peacefully sleeping. Barbara felt an overwhelming sense of joy. Now, Emma might not be able to communicate with the outside world just yet, but Barbara hoped this was a sign that maybe she was feeling more peaceful inside. It was a small glimpse of who Emma used to be, and Barbara hoped that it meant the nerve stimulation treatments were working, and that the old Emma was on her way back. Two years later, in 2016, Barbara sat down in the living room and opened up her laptop. Emma was 18 years old now, and they were still searching for a comprehensive treatment plan. Nerve stimulation had helped Emma, but she was by no means back to her normal self. She was still very withdrawn anytime they were out in public, and she suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, is a condition where people have unwanted thoughts and feel the need to do certain actions to ease their anxiety about them. They can interfere with their daily life. But, as always, her mom, Barbara, had a plan. A few days earlier, Barbara had spoken with Lucy, the woman who contacted her after her presentation at the Down syndrome conference. Lucy's daughter, Sierra, was also still struggling, and so they wanted to see if there were any other parents of Down syndrome children out there who had watched their kids regress and their personalities disappear. So they had started a Facebook support group. And now, Barbara clicked on that group's page, and she was immediately overwhelmed. It had been up for only a few days, but already dozens of parents had joined, posting stories of their once thriving children. And each post had a similar ending. Their kids suddenly regressed and became a shell of who they used to be without any explanation. Barbara couldn't believe how many stories like hers were pouring in. She called Lucy, and the two of them stayed on the phone, scrolling through the messages together. Parents asking for help, swapping tips and treatments, and sharing information about physicians who managed to help their kids in some way. Barbara loved the feeling of not being alone as she read through these posts. But she also realized something. Everyone seemed to have tips for mild improvement, but nobody had met any physician who had actually cracked the code and figured out what actually caused this regression in the first place. And so all these Facebook posts forced Barbara to confront a potentially heartbreaking reality. None of these kids and young adults were getting any better. It seemed like Emma's future was going to be about just adjusting to this new normal, not about regaining what she had lost. But Barbara could not accept that. Several years later, in April of 2020, a pediatrician named Dr. Christopher DeSantis sat in his Los Angeles office. Dr. DeSantis was the director of neuroimmunology at one of the largest pediatric medical centers in the country. And on this day, he was looking over the results of a spinal tap, a test he had run on one of his patients, a teenager with Down syndrome named Jackson. 1 year earlier, Jackson had become quiet and insular and basically stopped interacting with the world around him. And so Dr. DeSantis was trying his best to figure out what was wrong with Jackson. But this was proving to be very difficult to do because it was the COVID pandemic, and basically the whole world was shut down. The hospital required so much protective equipment and social distancing measures that it was very hard to schedule in-person appointments at all, let alone order lab work or other procedures to figure out what was going on. At least here, alone in his office, Dr. DeSantis could just focus on his patients and retain some feeling of normalcy. As he looked over the spinal tap test results, he realized there could be hope that he was close to figuring out the cause behind Jackson's change in behavior. The results suggested that there was inflammation in Jackson's brain, which is usually caused by some type of infection. But it can also happen when the patient's own immune system mistakenly attacks healthy tissue that it thinks is an infection, which is known as an autoimmune disorder. And people with Down syndrome have a much higher rate of common autoimmune disorders, such as thyroid disorders, celiac disease, and skin conditions. So, to Dr. DeSantis, it actually made perfect sense that maybe Jackson's regression could be caused by an autoimmune disorder. The doctor wondered if there was a way to reset Jackson's immune system so that the inflammation in his brain might decrease. And so he decided to try a standard treatment for immune disorders called intravenous immune globulin, which gradually purifies the immune system. If it worked, Jackson just might be able to reconnect with the world around him, instead of living inside of this isolating fog. 2 weeks later, Dr. DeSantis was back in his office catching up on work when he heard a commotion in the hallway, a mix of cheering and applause and stamping feet. Confused, he opened his door to see what was going on, and immediately felt a pair of arms wrap around his waist. He looked down to see his patient, Jackson, locking him in a bear hug. Then Jackson pulled back, smiling and laughing and telling him he felt better. Dr. DeSantis couldn't believe it. This was a completely different kid from the near catatonic teenager that checked into the hospital a month ago. The immune globulin treatment, in combination with a few other treatments, had brought Jackson back to life, so to speak. In fact, it was so successful that right away, Dr. DeSantis wondered if maybe other patients with Down syndrome could benefit from this treatment. And sure enough, a few months later, when Dr. DeSantis was surfing Facebook, he stumbled upon a support group for families with Down syndrome children who had regressed. Dr. DeSantis immediately reached out to the group and asked if he could post about his own research. Lucy Duncan was excited and told Dr. DeSantis to please post it. By this point, the Facebook group that she had set up with Barbara had hundreds of members who were eager for more and new information. And so the moment Dr. DeSantis began posting about his experimental treatment that had presumably cured his patient Jackson, responses on this page poured in. Not long after that, Lucy flew with her daughter, Sierra, out to Los Angeles to meet with Dr. DeSantis. He administered the same course of treatment for Sierra as he had for Jackson, and right away, Sierra did show signs of improvement. But then her progress just stopped. She didn't have the same dramatic turnaround that Jackson experienced. Dr. DeSantis suggested that maybe because Sierra had been in regression much longer than Jackson, that was why the treatment was not as effective. Lucy was bitterly disappointed, but then she remembered another researcher who had once taken an interest in Sierra's case. His name was Dr. Antonio Rivera. Now, he didn't have any answers at the time for what was going on with her daughter, but he had told her that he was going to continue his research. Lucy thought that maybe Dr. Rivera should know about Dr. DeSantis' research. So she pulled out her phone and sent an email to both doctors, introducing them. She hoped that, just maybe, they might find a way to help patients like her daughter and the hundreds of other people on their Facebook group, whose children had been in regression for 5 or even 10 years. Following Lucy's introduction, Dr. DeSantis reached out to Dr. Rivera, and he was delighted to learn that Dr. Rivera had continued his Down syndrome research. Dr. Rivera suspected that this regression was caused by the extra chromosome 21 that people with Down syndrome are born with. He believed the extra chromosome caused them to generate an overly powerful immune system that can sometimes turn on the body itself, making people sick instead of protecting them from disease. This would explain the inflammation Dr. DeSantis had discovered in the brain of his other patient, Jackson. Dr. Rivera suspected that medical researchers had not noticed this autoimmune disorder until now, at least in part because of the history of bias in the medical field about people with Down syndrome. And Dr. DeSantis agreed. If a typical teenager suddenly became a lethargic and moody loner, their doctors would treat it like a major issue. But Drs. DeSantis and Rivera both suspected that doctors generally paid less attention to antisocial behavior in people with Down syndrome because they already had an intellectual disability. Dr. DeSantis was thrilled to meet a doctor whose research aligned so closely with his own. The two of them decided to work together to bring attention and resources to this autoimmune disease. In 2022, Dr. DeSantis took the lead on a paper that named the condition Down syndrome regression disorder. In the paper, he explained that it affects between 1% and 5% of those with Down syndrome. In June of 2023, Emma finally received an official diagnosis after 12 years of regressing. In October of that year, she began immune globulin treatment. At that point, Emma was 25 years old, and her recovery was not as dramatic as some of Dr. DeSantis' younger patients. But the treatment still did make a significant improvement in her quality of life. She was now able to at least smile and joke around again. Recently, Emma graduated from a local university transition program for people with disabilities. She's making friends again, performing in community theater, and water skiing, something she hadn't been able to do for 10 years. On an August evening in 2010, 36-year-old Rusty Snyderman could barely contain his excitement as he talked to a small group of people in his kitchen in Dunwoody, Georgia, an upscale suburb of Atlanta. Rusty and his wife Andrea had some friends over, and people were spread out across the large suburban home, laughing, eating, and drinking. But in the kitchen, Rusty was talking to Hemi Newman, who was his wife's boss, along with a couple other friends, about a new business that Rusty was launching. Rusty was lanky with short brown hair, and he could barely see without his glasses on. And when he talked about something that he was passionate about, he used his whole body. And Rusty was very passionate about this new business idea, so he was very animated as he spoke. He told his captive audience that his idea was to start a company that provided celebrity voicemail services. So basically, somebody could pay a famous actor or singer or athlete to create the outgoing voicemail message on the person who was paying's phone, or a friend's phone as a gift or something like that. To make this more clear, if I were to pay for this, I would have a voicemail that would say, "Hey, you've reached the voicemail of John Allen, leave a message after the beep," but instead of it being my voice, it would be some celebrity saying as much. Now, remember, this was several years before celebrity video services like Cameo would come out, so the people listening to this idea had never heard of anything like this before, and they thought it was absolutely brilliant. Hemi, who was an executive at General Electric, which is a big appliance company, liked the idea, but did raise some questions about overhead costs and stuff like that. And the other people that were listening, Rusty's friends, they wanted to know how would he get these famous people on board with the concept. And Rusty, who people said was a born entrepreneur, had an answer for all their questions. And he really believed that if he did this right, the company would grow and it would even become something potentially that was so big and successful that he could pass it down to his kids. And so as Rusty was talking about his big plan, his wife Andrea stepped into the kitchen and overheard what they were talking about, and she quickly kind of chimed in that, maybe if this business is as successful as Rusty thinks, they wouldn't even need to worry about their kids' future job prospects. Their 5-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son would be just set because of this great business. And even though she was sort of joking about this, being so committed to this totally succeeding, there was some truth to that. She really believed this was going to be a success, same as Rusty. But Andrea's excitement was more about her husband having something to focus on rather than the actual company he was going to build. Andrea had known Rusty had a great mind for business since they started dating back in college at the University of Indiana. And not long after graduating, Andrea had moved with Rusty while he earned a master's degree from Harvard Business School. They had gotten married soon after that, moved to Georgia when Rusty got a job offer, and they started their family. And initially, things went great for Rusty on the work front. A few years earlier, in 2007, he'd gotten a job as the chief financial officer for a large chain of daycares, and he was making a ton of money. But over the last year, Rusty had begun clashing with the men who owned the company, and so they ultimately fired him. And that had changed everything back at their home. Andrea, who had always been kind of a math whiz, went ahead and got a job, and a really good one, a well-paying job at GE to support the family, and Rusty, who was now out of work, became a stay-at-home dad. Andrea knew Rusty did not resent her at all, even though her job often required her to travel a lot and leave him alone with the kids, but she also knew Rusty loved working. And so now that he had this new idea for this celebrity voicemail company, she just felt like he seemed so much happier and in such a better place, way better than he had been over the past couple of months. In the kitchen, Andrea grabbed a soda out of the fridge and asked her boss and Rusty's friends if they needed anything. They said they were fine, so Andrea said okay. She turned around and headed into the other room to speak to some of the other guests. Later that night, after all the guests had gone, Rusty and Andrea cleaned up the house, and as they did, they talked about what a great time they'd had. They also got excited discussing an upcoming cruise they were going on in a few months, just the two of them. Their kids would be with their grandparents, and so Rusty and Andrea would finally have time to reconnect, just the two of them. Even though things had been kind of tough the last few months, they both felt good about where their lives were heading. And to their surprise, they actually felt sort of lucky to live in this town of Dunwoody, Georgia. Rusty and Andrea had grown up in the Midwest of the United States, and they had really worried they wouldn't fit in when they moved here to the South. But over the years, Dunwoody had proven to be the perfect place for them. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in this beautiful secluded neighborhood that backed right up to sprawling woods filled with oak and pine trees. And they were close enough to Atlanta to also enjoy all the city had to offer as well. But most importantly, to Rusty and Andrea, Dunwoody had a tight, supportive Jewish community, which was not the case for a lot of suburbs in the area. Rusty and Andrea credited the Jewish community for helping them adjust to life in the South, and for weathering challenges like when Rusty had lost his job. So Dunwoody felt like home, a great town to raise their kids in, and the right place for Rusty to launch this next phase of his career. But a little later that night, as Rusty worked on his business proposal at the kitchen table, something so strange, almost completely unbelievable, was happening in Dunwoody. It was something that nobody who lived in the small suburb would have ever imagined. A few minutes from Rusty and Andrea Snyderman's house, a driver sat in their parked car on the side of a neighborhood street. The car felt ice cold, but sweat dripped down the driver's face. They could feel their chest getting tight, and they heard this loud rumbling sound coming from their passenger seat. The driver shook their head. "Please don't let this happen to me again." But there was nothing the driver could do. The car rattled, a light flashed outside, and then the demon appeared in the passenger seat. The driver tried to hide their eyes, but they couldn't look away, like the demon was forcing the driver to stare at it. The demon's head nearly touched the roof of the car, and its legs were massive. It wore a dark cloak and hood, and when the driver looked at it, they felt like all hope inside of them was just draining away. the demon turned its head away from the driver and began to talk. Its voice was deep and powerful. The driver thought the demon actually sounded like the 1970s soul and R&B singer Barry White, who was famous for songs like "Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe." The driver trembled, but the demon said there was no need to be afraid. The driver had been chosen to carry out a mission. The driver begged the demon to please leave them alone, but the demon said the mission was too important to ignore. Suddenly, the whole car shook and light flooded in from all sides. The driver shielded their eyes again, but they also felt a perfect sense of calm coming over them. They looked back at the passenger seat, and now the demon was gone. In its place sat an angel wrapped in light. The angel spoke, and the driver thought immediately that it sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, the actress and singer who had starred in movie musicals like Grease and Xanadu. When the angel spoke, they said the driver really was the only one who could carry out this very important mission the demon had already mentioned. So the driver asked, "What's the mission?" The angel smiled and said members of the Snyderman family were in grave danger, and the driver had to protect them. On the morning of November 10th, so about 3 months after the angel and demon appeared in that driver's car, Andrea rushed into her kitchen, holding her 5-year-old daughter's hand. Rusty was in the kitchen helping their son finish his breakfast. Andrea and her daughter both gave Rusty a kiss and told him they'd see him later, and then they headed out to the garage. Whenever Andrea was not traveling, she always made a point to drive her daughter to kindergarten on her way to work. It was just another way for her to bond with her child. After they were gone, Rusty's son finished eating, and Rusty cleaned up the kitchen and then got his son dressed for preschool. At about 8:30 a.m., Rusty carried his son out to the silver Infiniti car parked in the garage, opened up the garage door, and then buckled the boy into his car seat in the back. But before Rusty closed the car door, he hesitated. A strange smell was coming from outside. Rusty couldn't tell if it was gasoline or something else, so he walked out of the garage and scanned the yard. And he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. Rusty turned to the side of the house, and he saw someone laying in the grass. He didn't know if this person was sleeping or hurt or what was going on, so he just shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" The person jumped up and just stared at Rusty. It was a man with a thick black mustache, and he wore a wool hat and earmuffs. Rusty immediately felt like something is wrong with this person, so he turned, ran back into his garage, hopped in the car, locked the doors, and then he pulled out into the street with his little son in back. And then, as Rusty began to drive away, he looked and saw this man with the earmuffs running down a long path that led to the woods behind the cul-de-sac. Rusty had no idea what any of this meant, so he just grabbed his phone and called 911. When the emergency operator picked up, Rusty told them what he had just seen and gave as good of a description as he could of the man with the earmuffs. Rusty also said he thought he smelled something like gasoline outside of his house right before he saw this guy. The operator told Rusty they would send a police unit over right away to look around, and Rusty said, okay, great, but he still had to drive his son to school, but right after that, he would come back home and be ready to talk to police. A few minutes later, Rusty arrived at the preschool and walked his son inside, and then afterward, he headed right back home. And when he got there, police officers, firefighters, and a workman from the gas company were all arriving as well. Rusty told his story to the police again, and they said other officers were already out looking for this man he described. Then, the gas company employee said Rusty's house did have a gas leak, but nothing had been tampered with. Whoever had been at the house in the front yard didn't appear to have caused the leak. It was just an odd coincidence. And the guy said he had fixed the leak already, and the gas company employee said, the leak was a very easy fix. Later that day, after all the emergency personnel and the gas company employee were all gone, Rusty still didn't have any real answers about who the heck that guy was. Officers said that, the guy with the earmuffs could have been a homeless person sleeping near his house, but that made no sense to Rusty. Things like that just didn't happen in this neighborhood. But police had said that until they found this guy with the earmuffs and the mustache, there really wasn't much they could do. So that night, when Andrea came home and Rusty filled her in about this guy, they talked about it and just said, all we can do is be super vigilant whenever they left the house. And they said they would do their best not to worry too much. They didn't want the kids to get a sense that their parents were scared of something. But Rusty admitted he was glad that he and Andrea were leaving town for their cruise soon, and that the kids would not be at the house either. They'd be with their grandparents. And Rusty hoped that, by the time they all came back home after the cruise, things would be back to normal in the neighborhood. Meaning, the guy with the earmuffs and the mustache has been found, and hopefully will not be back anytime soon. 8 days later, at 9 a.m. on November 18th, Rusty pulled up to his son's preschool. Rusty and Andrea had gotten back from their cruise a couple of days earlier, and Rusty felt rejuvenated. And nothing strange had happened at the house since they'd returned, so he hoped that the man lying in the grass was just some weird one-time occurrence. Rusty unbuckled his son from the car seat and led him into the preschool. And then Rusty chatted with a few other parents who were also doing drop-offs, and then a few minutes later, Rusty was headed back towards his car. However, when Rusty reached his car and opened up the driver's side door, he suddenly heard footsteps, and he glanced over his shoulder, and he saw a man with brown hair and a beard walking quickly towards him. Seconds later, screams rang out in the preschool parking lot as a silver minivan peeled out and sped away. One of the other parents ran over to Rusty's car where the scream had come from. The driver's side door was still open, and Rusty lay on the ground in a pool of blood. The woman could see Rusty was still breathing, so she screamed for help and then called 911. In the shopping center right next to the preschool, a woman happened to see what was going on, and so she immediately ran into a doctor's office that happened to be nearby. And right away, a doctor and a nurse darted out of that office, and they ran over to Rusty. The doctor quickly checked Rusty's pulse and then began administering CPR. And soon, the doctor heard an ambulance siren wailing down the street. By this time, people from inside the preschool who heard all this commotion had began running outside into the parking lot. But luckily, all of the children were outside behind the school and had no idea what was happening, including Rusty's son. The ambulance arrived and paramedics took over for the doctor, trying to keep Rusty alive. They got Rusty onto a gurney, into the ambulance, and then they sped towards the hospital. A few minutes later, Detective Andrew Thompson of the Dunwoody Police Department arrived at the preschool. He saw a few of his fellow officers trying their best to keep a growing crowd away from Rusty's car. Detective Thompson had been a cop in Atlanta for 8 years before moving here to Dunwoody, but he'd only been a detective for about 2 years. And he'd also never been the lead investigator on a potential homicide, and he knew that's what he had on his hands right now. Thompson got out of his car, he briefly spoke with the officers on site, and then began taking witness statements. The few people who had seen what happened all said the same thing. A man with brown hair and a beard stepped out of a silver minivan, walked right up to Rusty Snyderman, and shot him multiple times. Then the man with the beard got back in the minivan and drove off. Other than the man having a beard, the witnesses didn't notice anything that stood out about the shooter's appearance. But one witness said the shooter seemed remarkably calm considering what he did. He walked up calm as can be, shot Rusty, and then turned and calmly walked back to the van before leaving. Detective Thompson thanked all the witnesses for their help and then kind of gently told them to please step back, and then he and the other officers began searching the area right around Rusty's car. A trail of blood now stretched out almost 40 feet across the parking lot. And to the side of the blood trail near the car, the police found 4 brass bullet casings that they believed were fired from a semi-automatic .40 caliber or .44 caliber weapon. And then, not long after Thompson and the others had found these bullet casings, Thompson got word that Rusty had unfortunately passed away at the hospital. Thompson was now officially leading a homicide investigation for the first time. While Detective Thompson searched the preschool parking lot for more evidence, Rusty's wife, Andrea, sat at her desk in GE's Atlanta offices. A minute later, her phone rang, and she noticed the call was coming in from her son's preschool. And so Andrea immediately answered, and the preschool administrator on the other line sounded very upset. She said Andrea's son was just fine, but Andrea needed to come to the school immediately. So, without thinking, Andrea grabbed her things and ran outside to her car, and as she was running towards it, she pulled out her phone and called her boss Hemi to let him know she was dealing with some kind of an emergency, and then she got in her car and sped back towards the suburbs. As soon as Andrea pulled into the preschool parking lot, she saw all these police officers who turned and looked at her, and immediately they walked right up to her, and so she rolled her window down, and they said, "You have to go to the hospital right now." Andrea demanded to know what was going on. Was her son really okay? And the police assured her her son was absolutely safe, but she still needed to go to the hospital right now. And when Andrea arrived at the hospital a few minutes later, there she would learn her husband had been gunned down in the preschool parking lot and had died shortly after. Detective Thompson spent most of the day in the preschool parking lot, working with the forensics team to see if there was any useful evidence they could find beyond just the bullet casings. But they didn't find much of anything else. So Thompson knew his biggest clues right then were that the killer had a beard and drove a silver minivan. None of the witnesses had gotten the license plate of this silver minivan, but Thompson had already called in an alert, so all the police departments in the area would be on the lookout for any vehicle that could possibly be a match. Thompson also arranged for a forensic sketch artist to meet with the witnesses and make a composite drawing of the shooter from all of their descriptions. By the time the sun set, Thompson already felt tired and a little overwhelmed, but he had no intention of stopping. So he got in his car and drove to Andrea and Rusty's house. Once he got there and parked his car, he stepped outside into the cool fall air. It was just above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And just a second later, he heard somebody calling his name. Thompson looked over and saw his boss, Sergeant Gary Cordellino, standing by his own car at the curb. Cordellino still wanted Thompson to take the lead on this case, but he knew the detective did not have a lot of experience working homicide cases, so he said he would just be there to help. Thompson thanked Cordellino for coming, and the two men walked up to the house together. Cordellino's strong New York accent was a major contrast to the soft southern drawl a lot of people in town spoke with. But just like Rusty and Andrea, Cordellino had come to consider this small town in Georgia home, even if he was originally an outsider from up north. Andrea opened up the front door, and it was clear she'd been crying. The detectives introduced themselves and asked if they could please come inside. But Andrea got a stern look on her face. She said her parents and her in-laws were there, and this was a house of mourning. She thought it was very disrespectful that the police would want to intrude so soon after her husband had died. But Detective Thompson was just not going to have this. He said they were investigating a murder, and they needed to ask her and the family some questions right now. But Andrea just repeated herself. The family was in mourning, and they had no intention of speaking to police right now. At this point, Thompson got an angry look on his face, and he was about to push Andrea further, but Sergeant Cordellino jumped in. He said they were very sorry for her and her family's loss, and then apologized to Andrea for disturbing her and her family at such a difficult time, and said they would come back the following day. Andrea's face softened, and then she thanked him and said she would be willing to talk to them tomorrow. She closed the door, and then the two detectives walked back towards their respective cars. Thompson couldn't believe what had just happened. Clearly, they needed to interview the victim's wife, like right now. But Cordellino told him that in his experience, grief could do some really strange things to people, and they were way better off not pushing Andrea right at this moment. Still, Cordellino did admit that it was worth noting that Andrea did not seem remotely eager to help. The following day, November 19th, 2010, Detective Thompson and Sergeant Cordellino returned to Andrea and Rusty's house, this time with a warrant to search the premises. Andrea still did not seem thrilled to have the police in her home, and she thought the warrant was totally unnecessary, but she still led them into the kitchen, and she and her family sat down and spoke to them. Over the course of about 2 hours, the detectives met with Andrea, her parents, Rusty's parents, and his brother. And they all pretty much said the same thing. Rusty was a great guy, people who knew him loved him, and they just couldn't imagine who would want to hurt him. This didn't surprise Thompson and Cordellino. Families often painted their dead relatives in the best possible light. It's just what you do, it's your family. Andrea told the detectives she couldn't think of anybody who fit the description of the bearded man that witnesses had seen. Then after she said it, she immediately shook her head like she had just remembered something. She said in all of the chaos and grief, she'd almost forgotten something really huge. The detectives asked what she meant, and Andrea said about a week earlier, Rusty had seen this weird guy with earmuffs on and a mustache laying in their front yard for no reason right as he was taking their son to school. Rusty had been so freaked out by seeing this guy who kind of inexplicably ran away that he called the police and gave a description of the guy. And again, part of that description was saying that this guy had this big black mustache. Thompson and Cordellino looked at each other. It was definitely possible the man with the big mustache and the earmuffs had grown out a full beard, and then by the time he was shooting Rusty, that's what you saw, his full beard, and not just a mustache. So maybe the shooter really was the same person Rusty had seen in the front yard. They talked to Andrea a bit longer, and then at some point they told her they wanted to take her and Rusty's computers to be searched. And again, Andrea got very upset. Detective Thompson thought it was strange that she still seemed unwilling to do whatever it took to help police find her husband's killer. But the detectives, in truth, did not really need Andrea to give them permission because they had a warrant. So they took the computers, then they thanked Rusty's family for talking to them, and then they left. Back at the station, Thompson and Cordellino handed off the computers for forensic data analysis, and then they dug up the report Rusty had filed about this weird guy he'd seen in his front yard. At that point, the detectives only knew there was a guy with this big mustache who might also be the big bearded guy who shot Rusty. It was not much to go on, and nobody in Rusty's family, or anybody from the preschool, remotely recognized this bearded guy. Then, something came to Thompson. He remembered what one of the witnesses had said, that the shooter seemed to be utterly calm when he walked up and shot and killed Rusty. And so Thompson floated the idea that, what if the shooter was a professional hitman who somebody had hired to kill Rusty? That would make sense because nobody would know who he was, and maybe he was wearing a disguise or something, and he certainly would be very calm walking up to do the killing because this is what he did professionally. And surprisingly, Cordellino did not think this was a far-fetched idea at all. In fact, he said, if this guy Rusty saw in the yard was also the shooter, this hitman potentially, he could have been at the house that day tracking Rusty's movements and learning his routines, something a professional killer would likely do. And when the detectives began delving into emails and other information they had found on Rusty and Andrea's computers, the hired killer theory only began to make more sense. The detectives found that during his time working as a chief financial officer, Rusty had clashed repeatedly with the business owners. And based on the emails, he and Andrea were not shy about telling other people exactly how they felt about those men. Also, since Rusty had begun working on creating his own company, the Celebrity Voicemail Company, he'd worked closely with a business partner as well as several potential investors. So there was a chance that maybe Rusty had just angered the wrong people when talking trash about his former bosses, or maybe he'd had a financial dispute with someone who was working with him on his new business. The detectives kept digging into Rusty and Andrea's computer data, but they also knew they could break everything wide open if they could just locate the silver minivan the shooter had been driving. So, with the help of other police departments in the state, they expanded the search radius for this minivan beyond just the Atlanta metropolitan area. And so soon, police were scouring security camera footage from roads and stores surrounding the city. The detectives also put together a list of people who might have had the motive and the money to hire a hitman to take Rusty out. On November 21st, 2010, so 3 days after Rusty's murder, sheets hung over the mirrors in Rusty and Andrea's house, and friends and family sat together on low stools in the front room. Rusty's funeral had taken place earlier that day, and now the people who had been closest to him were sitting Shiva. Shiva is a Jewish tradition in which family and friends gather together to mourn a dead loved one. They'll say prayers and often receive condolence calls from others. At the house, Andrea thanked her boss, Hemi, and her GE coworkers for coming. They had all been so worried about her when she got that call saying something was wrong at her son's preschool, but none of them could have imagined that call would eventually lead to this. A little while later, Andrea's boss, Hemi, began to lead the whole group in a prayer. Over 100 members of Hemi's extended family had actually died in the Holocaust, and so that had always inspired him to remain an active member of the Jewish community and to provide any help he could to those close to him, like Andrea. But while Andrea was sitting Shiva and listening to Hemi give this prayer, Detective Thompson and Cordellino just could not shake the feeling that Andrea had to be somehow involved in her husband's death. The police were still desperately trying to find the shooter's silver minivan, but their potential hired hitman theory had also led them to delve into Rusty's finances, and they had discovered that Andrea stood to get a $2 million payout from Rusty's life insurance policy. So along with being the murder victim's spouse, which by default made them a huge potential suspect, Andrea also had a clear financial motive to want her husband dead. And on top of that, she really had not seemed like she wanted to cooperate with police. And so the detectives decided they had to speak to Andrea again, but this time they wanted to isolate her from the rest of her family. On November 24th, almost a week after the murder, Thompson and Cordellino sat down with Andrea in an interview room at the police station. Andrea tucked her brown hair behind her ear, adjusted her glasses, and stared across a small white table at the two detectives. Thompson and Cordellino could tell Andrea was all business, and that she still clearly resented having to speak with the police. But they still started by thanking her for coming in, and then they asked her how her relationship had been with her husband prior to his murder. Andrea admitted things had gotten a bit strained between them when Rusty lost his job, but she said they'd worked through that. And other than typical husband and wife arguments, they actually got along really well. Andrea seemed totally matter-of-fact when she answered these questions. On the one hand, the detectives thought that made her seem almost unfeeling about her husband's death, like she didn't care. But Cordellino realized that this was a woman dealing with an impossible situation. Also, she was used to being in high-powered business meetings, so maybe this was just the way she conducted herself. Then, at some point, Cordellino asked Andrea if it was possible that Rusty could have been having an affair. Was there a jealous lover out there who might have had it out for him? But Andrea didn't flinch. She sort of half smiled and said the idea that Rusty was cheating on her was absurd. He was one of the most loving, supportive people she had ever met. He would never, ever do something like that to their family. So the detectives moved from Andrea and Rusty's personal relationship to their financial situation. But nothing Andrea said indicated that she would have killed Rusty for his life insurance policy. Rusty had put a lot of money away during his time working, and she got paid well at GE, so really, money was not an issue for them. So eventually, the detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked Andrea for her time. But after she left, Thompson and Cordellino felt like they didn't know much more than they did before she showed up. And for the life of them, they could not decide if that was because Andrea really just didn't know anyone who would want to hurt her husband, or if she was hiding something. In the weeks following that interview, no new leads came in, and Thompson and Cordellino began to get frustrated. They still didn't know if the man with the earmuffs and the mustache that Rusty had seen at the house was also the bearded shooter, or if those were two totally different people. And the detectives didn't know if this full bearded shooter had been hired by somebody else, or if it was someone who knew Rusty, that they had somehow overlooked that maybe had a specific reason to attack Rusty. But then, in mid-December, so about a month after Rusty's murder, Detective Thompson was sitting at his desk when one of his team members rushed over to him. And this young cop had a huge smile on his face. Thompson asked him what was going on, and the young cop said he'd been re-watching surveillance footage of the silver minivan as it drove down a street near the preschool. There still was not a clear shot of the license plate, but the young cop had spotted a small white sticker on the van's windshield that nobody had caught before. And he was sure that that was the type of sticker that rental car companies used to track their vehicles. Immediately, Detective Thompson stood up, full of energy. The young cop said, the sticker didn't point to a specific rental car company, but Thompson just put his hand up and said, nope, that doesn't matter. This is a huge discovery. Armed with this new information about this sticker, police reached out to and visited rental car companies all across the area. And after about a week or so of searching, they finally found a silver Kia Sedona minivan at a rental car lot 25 miles north of Dunwoody. And that van could absolutely match the shooter's vehicle. And when they checked that minivan's recent rental history, Thompson and Cordellino immediately recognized the name that came up. And they were sure right then and there they had found Rusty's killer. Based on information from the rental car company, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, this is what police think happened to Rusty Snyderman on the morning of November 18, 2010. On that day, at about 5:45 a.m., the killer heard the voice of the angel ringing in his head. That voice, that sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, had told the killer that time was running out. People were in danger, and the killer had their marching orders. This mission had to be accomplished now. The killer climbed into a silver minivan and then pulled out into the dark, empty early morning streets. The killer drove slowly, moving from dark to light as the van passed under each street lamp. Finally, they pulled the van onto Rusty and Andrea's street about an hour before the sun would rise. They parked their car a few houses down from Rusty's, and then they waited. But soon, the killer noticed lights turning on in some of the houses as people got ready for work and school and their morning routine. So the killer drove the van out of the neighborhood and found a spot on the street not too far from Rusty's son's preschool. The killer sat in the van, occasionally hearing the sound of the angel's voice encouraging them. And then at some point, the killer leaned over, opened up the glove box, and pulled out a semi-automatic pistol. They checked to make sure the gun was loaded, and when they saw it was, the killer laid down on the passenger seat. As the sun rose, the killer continued to just lay there, breathing very slowly in and out, very rhythmically, to ensure they remained calm. Then finally, around 9 a.m., the killer sat up and saw Rusty's Infiniti driving down the street towards them. The killer let Rusty drive by, and then quickly pulled out of their parking space, and then slowly tailed Rusty all the way to the preschool parking lot, and once they got there, the killer parked a few spaces away from Rusty's car. The killer watched as Rusty led his son into the preschool and began chatting with some parents inside of the doorway. As Rusty did this, the killer grabbed the gun off the passenger seat and held it in their lap. Then, a few minutes later, the killer saw Rusty walking back towards his car. At this point, the killer opened up the minivan door and, calm as can be, walked across the parking lot. Rusty had managed to open up his car door, but by that point, the killer was practically on top of him. The killer got within 3 feet of Rusty, raised their gun, and fired. The bullet struck Rusty on the left side of the jaw, traveling through his right shoulder and then lodged in his back. Rusty immediately collapsed to the ground, blood pouring out of his face and seeping through his shirt. The killer turned to walk back to the minivan, but then quickly wheeled back around and fired 3 more shots into Rusty's abdomen as he lay dying on the asphalt. After that, the killer turned and walked back to the minivan, got in, threw it in reverse, peeled out of the parking space, and then sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, the killer could see people running over to Rusty on the ground, but the killer felt confident they had killed Rusty and that the angel and demon would now be satisfied. A few minutes later, the killer pulled the van out onto a highway and disappeared into traffic. They drove for a while, exited off the highway, and then headed into a town 25 miles away from Dunwoody. There, they drove the van to the rental car company where they had gotten it, and they pulled it into the return lot. They checked the rearview mirror and looked out the windows. Nobody was nearby, so the killer reached up and yanked the brown wig off their head and also peeled the big fake beard off their face. The killer then stuffed the disguise pieces into a bag, got out of their rental car, and walked to a nearby auto repair shop where they had dropped off their real car for a minor repair the day before. The killer quickly paid for the work on their car and then drove off, headed towards General Electric's Atlanta offices. Some members of the investigative team had remained convinced that Rusty's wife Andrea had killed Rusty, but it turned out the shooter was somebody else who worked at GE. Andrea's boss, Hemi Newman. Police had talked to Hemi when they interviewed Andrea's friends and coworkers, but they didn't really focus on him as a potential suspect until they discovered the minivan at the rental car company. Hemi had used his real name to rent that car, and seeing Hemi's name on the rental form led Thompson and Cordellino back to Andrea's computer. And it turned out that she and Hemi had exchanged a number of emails that led police to believe their relationship was far more than just boss and employee. After police traced the rental van to Hemi, they interviewed and then arrested him. But they continued to push Andrea because they believed she and Hemi had worked together to kill Rusty, 2 lovers who wanted to be rid of Andrea's husband. That's when things got really weird. Hemi admitted to being in love with Andrea, and he even suggested that they had had an affair, though Andrea denied it. Still, Hemi said he did not arrange Rusty's murder with Andrea. Instead, he was simply following orders passed down to him from a demon and an angel who happened to sound like popular singers from the 1970s and 1980s. Talking to a psychiatrist, Hemi admitted that the Barry White-sounding demon had been visiting him for decades, dating back to when he was in college. But it was not until that angel appeared to him in the car on the night he had gone to Rusty and Andrea's house, and Rusty had talked about this new idea that he was going to make this company around celebrity voicemails, that Hemi understood his role in the cosmic battle of good versus evil. According to Hemi, the angel told him that Rusty was a threat to Andrea and the kids. In fact, the angel said Hemi was the true father of Andrea's son and daughter. And apparently, Rusty had found this out, this is again according to the angel, and so Rusty was bound to eventually murder his wife and kids as a result. That is, unless Hemi stopped Rusty by killing him first. To carry out this mission, Hemi first bought a big fake black mustache and slapped it on his face along with some earmuffs, and he spied on Rusty at his house. But of course, Rusty caught him laying on the front yard, but Rusty had no idea it was actually Hemi because the disguise worked. And then after that, when Hemi learned Rusty's routine, he bought a different disguise, the wig and the big fake beard, for the day of the murder. In court, Hemi's defense team entered an insanity plea and then proceeded to trace Hemi's complete and disturbed history with this demon and angel. But the prosecution never bought any of this. They remained convinced that Hemi had concocted this whole story to avoid life in prison. They also believed that Andrea Snyderman, not some angel or demon, was the one who actually put Hemi up to murdering her husband. The jury found Hemi guilty of murder, but they also deemed him mentally ill. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and as of 2024, he is incarcerated at the Augusta State Medical Prison. But after Hemi's conviction, police and the DA stayed focused on Andrea. She was eventually arrested and charged with murder, along with multiple other counts. But the murder charge was dropped, and she was never tried in connection to her husband's death. However, Andrea was found guilty on multiple counts that pertained to hindering the murder investigation. Andrea would go on to serve just 22 months of a 5-year prison sentence, and when she got out of prison, she received the $2 million from Rusty's life insurance policy and maintained custody of her 2 kids.
Footsteps ringing on the iron-bound earth, dust of ages rising into birth. Echoes carve the road for all it's worth, guiding me beyond what I'm unsure of. Every clang becomes a
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen's Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today,